Welcome to Underwire History. Springhill, Nova Scotia, suffers a serious mining disaster, unfolded through interacting constraints rather than one isolated trigger. Decision-makers operated within institutional limits, and each response narrowed the next available option. The evidence points to compounding risk rather than a single dramatic cause. That causal chain becomes clearer when incentives, governance, and timing are read together. The Springhill Mining Company's decision-makers operated within the constraints of their institutional limits, but these limits were themselves being pushed by escalating pressures. Profit margins had narrowed significantly since the late 1880s, forcing the company to cut corners and increase production rates. New technologies promised greater efficiency, but also presented technical risks that weren't fully understood at the time. Safety inspectors struggled to keep up with the pace of innovation, and their reports often went unheeded by management. In an environment where accidents were seen as a minor cost of doing business, the company's primary concern remained productivity over safety. The convergence of these factors created a perfect storm of risk, one that would ultimately prove catastrophic for the town of Springhill. The Springhill Mining Company's decision-makers were under pressure to meet production targets and maintain profitability. Their primary concern remained productivity over safety, a mindset that would have far-reaching consequences for the town. As new technologies promised greater efficiency, management was eager to implement them, even if it meant pushing the boundaries of what was safe. However, these innovations also presented technical risks that weren't fully understood at the time and were not always disclosed to workers or regulators. The company's focus on productivity over safety created a culture where accidents were seen as a minor cost of doing business. As the mining operation continued to expand, the risk of a catastrophic accident grew, one that would eventually engulf the town of Springhill. Consequences and response reshaped what decision-makers could do next, because each institutional response changed the incentives facing the next actor. In the aftermath of the disaster, a commission was established to investigate the cause of the tragedy. The inquiry highlighted systemic issues with safety inspections and regulatory oversight. These findings underscored the need for more robust safety protocols and greater accountability within the industry. Decades later, similar concerns about worker safety and corporate accountability continue to resonate in modern mining operations. Regulatory frameworks have evolved to prioritize prevention over mere compliance, but the legacy of Springhill serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing productivity over people. The Commission's report led to significant changes in provincial regulations, including stricter safety standards and increased enforcement powers for inspectors. The tragedy also sparked a national debate on corporate accountability, with some calling for tougher penalties for companies found liable for negligence. The town of Springhill was eventually rebuilt, but the disaster left a lasting impact on its residents, many of whom continued to work in the mining industry despite concerns about safety. New safety protocols and regulations were implemented, including regular maintenance checks, improved emergency response plans, and enhanced training for miners. In 1979, the federal government passed the Canada Labour Code, which mandated more stringent safety standards and increased penalties for non-compliance. The changes brought about a shift in industry culture, with companies like Dominion Coal recognizing the need to prioritize worker safety above productivity goals. However, the legacy of Springhill continued to influence policy decisions, with some arguing that the disaster led to overregulation and stifled innovation in the sector. The Commission's report identified a culture of complacency among mine operators who prioritized profit over safety. A 1978 investigation by the CBC's The Fifth Estate exposed lax enforcement by provincial regulators and inadequate training for miners. The Springhill disaster highlighted the devastating consequences of corporate negligence and regulatory failures. In the years following the tragedy, there was a growing recognition that safety standards needed to be more than just a compliance checkbox. Provincial governments began to reassess their regulatory frameworks, with some jurisdictions adopting more proactive approaches to prevention. For example, Nova Scotia introduced regular inspections and increased fines for non-compliance with safety regulations. The mining industry itself also underwent significant changes, with companies like Dominion Coal investing in improved training programs and emergency response protocols. However, not all companies were willing to adapt, and some continued to prioritize productivity over people. A 1980 report by the Nova Scotia Department of Labour found that many mine operators were still prioritizing profit over safety, despite new regulations and guidelines. The Commission's report had also highlighted a lack of accountability among company executives, with few facing consequences for negligence or reckless behavior. In response to these findings, some advocates began pushing for tougher penalties for companies found liable for negligence, as well as greater transparency around corporate practices and decision-making processes. In the early 1980s, a new mine opened in Cape Breton, promising better working conditions and safer operations. However, investigations later revealed that the mine's owners had cut corners on safety measures to meet production targets. The incident highlighted the ongoing struggle between profit-driven interests and regulatory bodies. The introduction of stricter regulations and improved enforcement mechanisms led to increased costs for mining companies, putting pressure on their profitability. Some operators responded by lobbying governments to relax or repeal new laws, while others invested in cost-saving technologies and more effective training programs. A 1982 article in the Globe and Mail exposed a culture of secrecy among mine owners, where financial information was often withheld from regulators and workers alike. This lack of transparency raised concerns about the true impact of safety regulations on company bottom lines and the ability to accurately assess risks. Some industry experts argued that the trend towards stricter regulations would ultimately lead to consolidation in the sector, as smaller operators struggled to comply with new costs and requirements. In 1983, a group of prominent mine owners formed an association to promote responsible mining practices and lobby against what they saw as overly restrictive regulations. The growing debate over regulatory effectiveness and industry accountability led some lawmakers to propose the creation of independent oversight bodies to monitor compliance and enforcement. However, opposition from the mining lobby and concerns about added bureaucracy stalled these efforts. A 1984 report by the Nova Scotia Department of Labour found that the majority of mine operators had implemented some form of training program for new hires, but many still fell short in providing adequate instruction on emergency procedures and hazard recognition. This disconnect between policy and practice underscored the need for more effective implementation and monitoring mechanisms. The tension between regulatory bodies and industry interests continued to escalate, with both sides trading accusations over the impact of safety regulations on competitiveness and job creation. The stakes were high as the fate of mining communities and workers hung in the balance. A key figure in this debate was Ronald MacPherson, a veteran union leader who had been advocating for tougher safety standards and greater transparency in the industry. He argued that the focus on consolidation and profitability was misplaced, given the risks posed to workers and communities by inadequate regulatory enforcement. MacPherson's efforts gained traction with some lawmakers who proposed legislation to strengthen oversight bodies and improve monitoring mechanisms. However, opposition from the mining lobby and concerns about added bureaucracy stalled these efforts, leading Macpherson to shift his focus towards grassroots mobilization and community organizing. In 1985, a coalition of union leaders, local politicians, and environmental groups formed the Nova Scotia Mining Justice Coalition, which aimed to address the systemic issues plaguing the industry through education, advocacy, and policy reform. The coalition's efforts culminated in the creation of the Cape Breton Coal Workers' Memorial, dedicated to the memory of miners who had lost their lives in the industry. This development marked a significant shift towards community-driven activism, with workers, families, and local residents taking a more active role in shaping the future of mining in Nova Scotia. Macpherson continued to play a key role in this movement, leveraging his influence to push for legislative reforms that prioritized worker safety and environmental sustainability over industry profits. In 1987, the Nova Scotia government established the Coal Mining Safety Act, which introduced stricter regulations on mine operators and improved oversight mechanisms. However, the mining lobby responded by launching a series of high-profile lawsuits against the government, alleging that the new regulations were unduly burdensome and would drive industry jobs out of the province. A key court case, v. Nova Scotia Mining Association, tested the constitutionality of the Coal Mining Safety Act, with a Supreme Court ruling ultimately upholding its provisions. The ruling was a significant victory for Macpherson and the coalition, but it also sparked renewed opposition from industry groups, who intensified their lobbying efforts to water down or repeal the regulations. The court case's outcome had far-reaching consequences. The mining lobby launched a series of high-profile lawsuits against the government. In 1988, the Nova Scotia government passed the Environmental Protection Act, which established new standards for environmental assessment and mitigation. However, industry groups challenged the act in court, arguing that it was an overreach of regulatory authority. A key test case was the proposed expansion of the Donkin mine, which had been the site of several high-profile accidents and environmental incidents. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, opposed the project, citing concerns about water pollution and habitat disruption. In 1990, a coalition of community groups, including the Nova Scotia Mining Justice Coalition, launched a campaign to block the expansion. Highlighting concerns about public health and safety, the campaign gained national attention, with protests and rallies held across the province and in major cities like Halifax and Sydney. Industry leaders accused Macpherson and the coalition of reckless endangerment and anti-progressive obstructionism. Macpherson responded by pointing to the long history of industry negligence and lax regulations as evidence that their efforts were necessary. As the debate raged on, a new player entered the scene, the International Labour Organization, ILO, which had been monitoring the situation in Nova Scotia. The ILO's report highlighted the alarming rate of workplace injuries and illnesses in the province, particularly among coal miners. The report also criticized the lack of effective enforcement mechanisms and the prevalence of underreporting. In response to the report, the Nova Scotia government announced plans to strengthen worker safety training programs and improve reporting requirements. However, industry groups continued to resist these efforts, citing concerns about added costs and regulatory burdens. Macpherson and the coalition pushed back against these claims, arguing that enhanced safety measures would ultimately benefit both workers and the environment. The Nova Scotia government's decision to establish the Coal Mining Safety Act in 1987 was met with fierce resistance from industry groups, who argued that the new regulations would drive jobs out of the province. A key factor contributing to this opposition was the influence of major mining corporations, such as Brascan and Dominion Coal. These companies had significant economic clout in Nova Scotia and were able to mobilize their lobbying efforts to pressure the government into watering down or repealing the regulations. The lobbying efforts of industry groups were further amplified by the presence of key politicians, including Progressive Conservative Premier John Buchanan. Buchanan's administration was seen as being closely tied to the interests of the mining lobby, and his government's policies often reflected this allegiance. In 1991, a report by the Nova Scotia Department of Labour highlighted the staggering number of workplace injuries and illnesses in the province's coal mining industry, with over 1,000 cases reported between 1985 and 1990. The report also noted that many of these incidents could have been prevented if proper safety protocols had been followed, emphasizing the need for stronger regulations and more effective enforcement mechanisms. Despite this evidence, industry groups continued to resist efforts to strengthen worker safety measures, arguing that they would increase costs and regulatory burdens on operators. Macpherson and the coalition countered by pointing out that improved safety measures would not only protect workers, but also reduce long-term healthcare costs and environmental degradation associated with mining activities. Thanks for listening to Underwire History. Look forward to seeing you next time.